My name is Anna. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with safe words: dependable, quiet, easy to work with. The kind of person you don't worry about leaving behind when decisions are made because you assume she'll still be there when you come back. I've worked in structured environments most of my career: offices with glass walls, calendars booked weeks in advance, and managers who speak confidently about vision. On the surface, my role looked ordinary. I showed up on time, I did my work well, I didn't cause friction, and because of that, I was often underestimated. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but casually, as if my presence was permanent background noise. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or proving I was right all along. It's about something quieter than that. It's about how power shifts when someone stops needing to be seen, and how comfort breeds mistakes, especially for those who believe other people will always stay exactly where they left them. For a long time, the story other people told about me was simple. I was loyal, I was grateful, I was unlikely to leave. In fact, the unspoken assumption, one I would later hear out loud, was almost flattering in its certainty. My manager thought I'd never quit. Not because I wasn't capable of more, but because I had never demanded it. What follows is a slow story. There are no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no sudden twists of fate. The emotional journey here is internal. It moves through invisibility, normalization, quiet awareness, and finally, a decision made without applause. If you're expecting outrage, you won't find it. If you're looking for honesty about what it feels like to be underestimated for years and what it takes to walk away without burning anything down, then this may resonate. I'm telling this in the first person because it happened to me, but I don't believe it's only my story. Many of us live inside roles we didn't consciously choose: reliable, supportive, low maintenance. Those roles come with unspoken expectations, and over time they shape how others treat us and how we treat ourselves. I want to be clear about one thing from the beginning. No one here is a cartoon villain. People did what made sense to them based on the version of me I allowed them to see. And for a long time, I participated in that version willingly. This story isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through who I was to them, the small moments that didn't seem important at the time, and the quiet preparation that happened long before anyone realized something had changed. There's no triumph at the end, only clarity and a different kind of peace. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed in a place longer than you should have, simply because everyone assumed you always would? I didn't arrive at that job with ambition burning in my chest. I arrived with intention. I wanted stability. I wanted to be good at something and leave work at work. At the time, that felt like maturity, like choosing balance over ego. To them, I was the steady one. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, but I was always prepared. When someone forgot a detail, I filled it in without comment. When timelines slipped, I absorbed the pressure quietly and adjusted. Over time, people stopped checking whether I could handle things. They assumed I already was. If you'd asked my coworkers to describe me, they would have said things like reliable or solid, maybe even a lifesaver, but never essential, never strategic. I existed in that comfortable middle space where competence becomes invisible. I noticed early on how perception worked. The people who spoke confidently, even when they were wrong, were remembered. The people who delivered quietly were depended on, but rarely protected. I learned that if you don't claim space, others will decide how much you're allowed to occupy. Still, I didn't resent it. Not then. I told myself I preferred it this way. Less attention meant fewer politics. Fewer politics meant less stress. I became very good at telling myself that being overlooked was a form of freedom. My manager liked me. That much was clear. He trusted me, delegated to me, leaned on me. But the trust had a shape to it. It was narrow. I was trusted to execute, not to influence, trusted to fix, not to decide, trusted to stay. There's a difference between being valued and being relied upon, and I lived in that difference for years. In meetings, I was often the last to speak if I spoke at all. Not because I lacked opinions, but because I learned that my ideas landed better when someone else introduced them. When I spoke too early, they were acknowledged politely and then bypassed. When I spoke later, after someone else struggled to articulate the same thing, they were suddenly aligned. So I adjusted, I adapted, I became efficient at being useful. What they never seemed to ask was whether I wanted more, whether I was growing, whether I was staying because I chose to, or because it was easier than disrupting the image they had of me. From their perspective, I was stable. I had been there long enough to feel permanent. I didn't complain. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't negotiate aggressively. And so, without anyone ever saying it directly, a quiet assumption settled into the room. I would always be there. That assumption shaped everything. Opportunities were discussed around me, not with me. Decisions were finalized before I was informed. Raises came predictably, modestly, never urgently. There was no malice in it, just habit, comfort, and comfort breeds mistakes. At the time, I didn't call it that. I called it loyalty. I called it patience. I told myself that consistency would eventually be rewarded, that someone would notice the way the system held together because I was there. But invisibility doesn't feel dramatic while you're living inside it. It feels practical, logical, even responsible. I was the person they depended on not to change. And for a long time, I didn't. The first moment didn't arrive with weight. That's what made it easy to dismiss. It happened in a weekly planning meeting, the kind that blurred into itself after a while. Same conference room, same agenda template, same predictable rhythm of updates and half-finished sentences. I had prepared a short summary, nothing ambitious, just a clarification about a process bottleneck I'd been quietly managing for months. When it was my turn to speak, I explained it calmly. I outlined the issue, the risk if it continued, and a simple adjustment that would prevent it from compounding later. My manager nodded while I spoke. Not engaged, not disengaged, just present enough to signal politeness. Then the conversation moved on. 10 minutes later, one of my colleagues, well-meaning, confident, and less familiar with the details, raised the same concern, almost word for word. He framed it as a new realization. This time, my manager leaned forward, asked questions, praised the insight, wrote it on the whiteboard. No one looked at me. It wasn't dramatic. No one cut me off or dismissed me outright. There was no humiliation, just a quiet erasure, clean and efficient, as my contribution had never happened at all. I felt it then, a small internal flinch, the kind you notice but don't yet name. I told myself it didn't matter. The idea was what counted, not the credit. I told myself I didn't need recognition to feel secure. I even told myself it was generous to let others shine. Those explanations were convincing because they weren't entirely false. But something about that moment stayed with me. Not the behavior itself, but how easily it happened. How naturally the room accepted the rewrite. After the meeting, my manager stopped by my desk and thanked me for keeping things running smoothly, as always. He didn't mention the idea. He didn't mention the conversation. He smiled, like everything was exactly as it should be. I smiled back. That was the cut. Not because it hurt deeply, but because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. My voice existed in the room, but it didn't anchor anything. It floated. It could be picked up, rebranded, and set down by anyone else without friction. Over the next few weeks, similar moments followed. Small, easy to rationalize. A decision I wasn't looped into until after it was finalized. A project scope changed without my input, even though I was the one expected to manage the fallout. A deadline was promised on my behalf without anyone checking whether it was realistic. Each time I adjusted, I compensated, I fixed, and each time I felt that same subtle tightening in my chest, Not anger, not yet, just awareness. What unsettled me wasn't the disrespect itself. It was how invisible it was to everyone else. No one thought anything wrong had happened. There were no apologies because, in their minds, there had been no offense. That's the nature of the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention. It simply changes how you see the landscape. I began to notice patterns I'd ignored before. Who was consulted early? Who was informed late? Whose time was protected? Whose flexibility was assumed? Mine was always assumed. And because I had always delivered, because I had never pushed back, that assumption felt justified to them. It was efficient, logical, comfortable. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't bring it up in a one-on-one. I didn't correct the narrative in the room. Instead, I did something quieter. I remembered. I started to catalog these moments, not with bitterness, but with precision. Dates, context, outcomes. Not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the system I was participating in. That first small cut taught me something important. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives dressed as oversight. Sometimes it hides behind politeness. And sometimes it only becomes visible when you stop explaining it away. At the time, I still believed the best response was patience. That if I stayed consistent, if I kept showing up prepared and calm, the imbalance would correct itself. I didn't yet understand that consistency in the wrong context can become permission. Once you explain something away enough times, it stops feeling like a problem. It starts feeling like the weather. Uncomfortable maybe, but not actionable. That's how the disrespect settled in. Gradually, quietly, until it felt normal. By then, the small cuts had blended into the routine. A comment that framed my work as support rather than leadership. A meeting invite was sent after decisions were already aligned. Praise that focused on my attitude instead of my impact. "You're so easy to work with," my manager said once, smiling as if it were a compliment without consequence. I smiled back even though something in that sentence tightened my shoulders. Easy meant flexible. Flexible meant adjustable. Adjustable meant expendable if it ever came to that. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of it was strategy, even if I didn't call it that yet. Speaking up felt risky in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I worried that naming the imbalance would make me sound ungrateful, or worse, emotional. I had watched other women try to recalibrate how they were treated, only to be labeled difficult or overthinking. I told myself I was being smart by not reacting. Another part of it was habit. I had been rewarded my whole life for being self-sufficient, for not needing much, for absorbing discomfort without making it anyone else's problem. That training doesn't disappear just because you recognize it. So when my workload quietly increased without a title change, I adjusted. When a junior colleague was positioned as the face of a project I had architected, I rationalized it. When my calendar filled with last-minute asks labeled "quick favor," I made room. Each time I said yes without saying yes. I showed my agreement through action, not words, and every unspoken yes reinforced the version of me they already believed in. What struck me later was how little effort it took to maintain that imbalance. No one needed to actively push me down. All they had to do was assume I would adapt, and I did. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being competent in silence. It's not the exhaustion of overwork. It's the exhaustion of erasure, of knowing that if you disappeared tomorrow, people would scramble, but they still wouldn't name what they lost. I began to feel it most in one-on-one meetings. My manager would ask how I was doing, genuinely curious, and I would answer honestly, but selectively. "I'm fine," I'd say, "busy, but manageable." And it was true. Everything was manageable as long as I kept shrinking the part of myself that wanted acknowledgement. I told myself that visibility was optional, that fulfillment didn't have to come from work. I was lucky to have stability. All of that was true, and all of it was incomplete. The turning point of this phase wasn't a single incident. It was a realization that arrived slowly, like a bruise you only notice when you press on it. I realized that my silence wasn't neutral. It was actively shaping how others treated me. By staying quiet, I was teaching them what I would tolerate. That awareness didn't make me angry. It made me calm in a different way, more observant, less invested in being liked. I stopped explaining myself as much. I started listening more closely, not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. And what was assumed was this: I would stay, I would adjust, I would continue to be the reliable constant in a system that benefited from my consistency. At that point, I still believed I could course correct internally, that I could redefine my role without disrupting the equilibrium. That patience, applied a little longer, would eventually turn into recognition. What I didn't yet see was that I had already been assigned a role, and it wasn't one that allowed for growth without resistance. The realization didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By then, I understood the part I played in the organization, not the one listed in my job description, but the one everyone relied on without naming. I was the stabilizer, the one who caught what fell through the cracks, the one whose competence made other people's confidence possible. I wasn't seen as someone in motion. I was seen as infrastructure. That role has a strange kind of respect attached to it. People appreciate you, but they don't imagine you elsewhere. You're woven into the background of how things work. Removing you feels inconvenient, not unthinkable. I saw it clearly during a restructuring conversation that I wasn't meant to hear. I was in the conference room early, reviewing notes, when two senior leaders stepped in, mid-discussion. They paused when they saw me, but not before one of them said, "Well, at least we know Anna will keep things steady." It was said casually, reassuringly. They apologized for interrupting, waited while I gathered my things, and continued once I left. But that sentence stayed with me. Not because it was unkind, but because it was definitive. They didn't say I would lead, or adapt, or grow. They said I would keep things steady. That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. Once I named it, I saw how consistently it showed up. When a project needed rescuing, I was looped in quietly. When something succeeded, the spotlight went elsewhere. When leadership talked about future potential, my name wasn't included, not because I lacked it, but because my potential wasn't disruptive enough to imagine. I wasn't offended, I was clarified. There's a difference. Offense seeks reaction. Clarity seeks adjustment. I realized that the version of me they trusted was the version that didn't ask for more. The moment I stepped outside that role, I would no longer be predictable. And predictability was what made me valuable to them. I understood then why earlier attempts to contribute strategically had been gently redirected. Why do my ideas land better when voiced by others? Why my loyalty had been quietly repaid with permanence, not progression. They weren't trying to hold me back. They were trying to preserve the system as it was. And I had helped build that system. This wasn't about gender or personality or even management failure. It was about comfort, about how organizations shape people into what they need and how easily those shapes harden into expectations. The uncomfortable truth was this: I had never corrected their perception because it benefited me too. The role protected me from scrutiny, from risk, from having to prove myself in louder ways. But it also capped me. That afternoon, I wrote something in my notebook. Not a complaint, not a plan, just a sentence. If I stay silent, this is who I will remain. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation. I didn't act on it immediately. I didn't resign. I didn't ask for a promotion. I didn't even schedule a difficult conversation. What changed was internal. I stopped seeing my role as fixed. And once you stop believing a role is permanent, you start noticing exits. Not physical exits, yet. Conceptual ones. Possibilities that had always existed but hadn't felt available because they conflicted with who you were expected to be. I began to understand something subtle but powerful. As long as I continued to perform the role flawlessly, no one had an incentive to reimagine me. And that realization carried a quiet weight, because it meant that if anything was going to change, it wouldn't start with them. It would start with me choosing whether I was willing to remain essential, but replaceable. The day everything shifted didn't look important from the outside. No meeting, no conflict, no raised voices. Just a moment so small it could have passed without leaving a mark if I hadn't been paying attention. It was late afternoon and the office had thinned out. That quiet stretch between the end of scheduled work and the beginning of people leaving early. I was reviewing a set of reports I had prepared for a leadership update the following week. They were clean, thorough, and, if I was honest, better than necessary. My manager stopped by my desk. He leaned against the partition, casual, comfortable, asked how things were going. I gave the usual answer. Then he said something that, on its own, sounded harmless. "Just make sure everything's buttoned up," he said. "If anything goes wrong, we'll need you to handle it." If anything goes wrong. Not we, not the team, me. There was no malice in his tone. It was trust in his mind, confidence. But in that sentence, I heard the full weight of the role I'd been carrying. I was the contingency plan, the safety net, the quiet insurance policy. I nodded. Of course, I would handle it. I always did. He thanked me and walked away, already mentally elsewhere. I sat there for a few minutes after he left, staring at the screen without reading, and something in me settled, not with resignation, but with clarity. I realized that I had been living inside a loop. Be dependable, be overlooked, be needed, be taken for granted. Repeat. And I understood something else, just as calmly. No amount of perfection inside that loop would ever change how I was seen. It would only reinforce it. That wasn't painful. It was liberating. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to be better for them and started asking how to be honest with myself. Was I learning? Was I growing? Was I staying because it aligned with my values? Or because leaving would disrupt the identity I had built around being needed? The answer came without drama. I had outgrown the role, not angrily, not impatiently, just factually. That moment didn't make me want to confront anyone. It didn't make me want to demand recognition or threaten to leave. It made me want to observe more carefully, to slow down, to choose my silence rather than default to it. For the rest of that week, I worked as I always had, but with a subtle shift. I noticed where my effort went. I noticed what assumptions were made on my behalf. I noticed how often temporary asks became permanent expectations. And I stopped correcting them. Not out of spite, out of data collection. I began to understand that silence could be more than endurance. It could be space. Space to see clearly, space to decide without pressure. That day marked the end of something, though no one else knew it yet. The end of my unconscious participation in a role that no longer fits. There was no promise made to myself, no deadline, just a quiet internal agreement. I would not act until I could do so cleanly, without emotion driving the outcome. And in that stillness, something important began to form. Not urgency, direction. After that shift, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, a learned response shaped by habit and caution. Now, it was deliberate. I spoke when it served clarity. I withheld when it served understanding. The difference was subtle, but it altered how I moved through my days. I stopped volunteering explanations in meetings, not to test anyone, not to provoke confusion, but to see what would happen if I didn't automatically fill the gaps. And what happened was predictable. Small delays, mild uncertainty. Questions were asked later than they should have been. No one connected those moments to me. They just adjusted around them, the way people do when they assume the foundation beneath them is still solid. They mistook my quiet for compliance. That assumption gave me space. I used it to listen more carefully, to map where decisions actually came from, to notice which processes were fragile, which ones relied on memory instead of documentation, which ones lived only in my head. It became clear how much of the organization's smooth operation depended on invisible continuity, on me knowing how things had always been done and why. I didn't weaponize that knowledge. I simply stopped cushioning the system as much. When last-minute requests came in labeled urgent, I responded professionally, but without absorbing the stress. I clarified timelines. I asked for priorities in writing. I let natural friction exist instead of smoothing it away. No one objected. In fact, most people appreciated the clarity. What they didn't realize was that clarity creates records. And records create leverage, not in the sense of control, but in the sense of choice. My manager continued to trust me implicitly. He assumed my quiet meant I was content, that I was steady, that I wasn't going anywhere. Comfort breeds mistakes. He stopped checking in as closely, stopped looping me into conversations early, stopped asking how long things took because they always got done. That trust, misplaced in its certainty, was the opening. I began documenting processes more thoroughly than ever before. Not for praise, not for handoff, for myself. I wrote down dependencies, bottlenecks, and workarounds that had never been formalized. I noted which relationships mattered and which approvals were performative. This wasn't an act of rebellion, it was preparation. Silence, when chosen, is not passive. It's observant. It gives you a clean view of the system you're inside. And what I saw was this. I had more agency than anyone realized, not because I held power, but because I held continuity. I understood how things connected, and understanding creates options. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. There was no need. I wasn't planning an exit yet. I was building the ability to choose one. The irony was that the quieter I became, the more predictable they assumed I was. My manager grew more relaxed around me, more casual. He spoke freely, assuming alignment. At one point he joked, "I don't know what we'd do without you, but thankfully we don't have to worry about that." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was revealing. They believed my silence meant permanence. That belief made them careless. And carelessness, when paired with underestimation, creates opportunity. I wasn't waiting for a breaking point anymore. I was waiting for clarity to mature into a decision. And that kind of waiting looks exactly like compliance from the outside. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It hides inside routines, inside normal-looking days that pass without comment. From the outside, nothing about me appeared different. Same hours, same tone, same calm presence. That was what made it effective. What they never noticed was how my attention had shifted. I stopped thinking in terms of tasks and started thinking in terms of systems. Who initiated the decisions? Who approved them? Who depended on whom? I watched how information flowed or didn't. I noticed how often people asked me questions they should have known the answers to, and how rarely anyone questioned why I had those answers in the first place. I began to separate what I did from what I knew. What I did was visible, what I knew was not. For years, I had been the informal archive, the person people went to when something didn't make sense, when a process broke, when a history needed explaining. I had absorbed that role without thinking about its implications. Now I cataloged it. I refined my documentation quietly. Not just step-by-step instructions, but context, rationale, decision trails, the why behind the how. I organized it for myself, not for handover. I wanted to understand exactly how replaceable or irreplaceable I was. The answer surprised me. Individually, none of what I did was extraordinary. Anyone competent could learn it. But the combination of responsibilities, relationships, and institutional memory was rare, not because I was special, but because no one else had been asked or trusted to hold all of it. That realization didn't inflate my ego. It grounded me. It meant that if I ever chose to leave, the disruption wouldn't be dramatic. It would be subtle, delayed, expensive in ways that were hard to trace back to a single source. I didn't intend to cause harm, but I needed to understand the truth of my position before making any decision. I also began learning, quietly, deliberately, skills adjacent to my role that I'd never had time for because I'd been too busy holding things together. I took courses at night, read the documentation others skimmed, asked questions framed as curiosity, not ambition. No one suspected a thing. Why would they? My silence fit the story they had already written about me. The dependable constant doesn't reinvent herself. She maintains. Meanwhile, I paid attention to language. How often people said we when they meant you? How often was it created by poor planning and then framed as teamwork? How often my flexibility had allowed others to avoid accountability? I stopped rescuing timelines that weren't mine to save. I let consequences land softly but visibly, just enough to be noticed, not enough to be traced back to intent. That balance took discipline. There were moments when I wanted to speak up, to correct assumptions, to assert myself openly, but I resisted that impulse, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something new. Premature visibility would collapse my options. As long as they believed I was exactly who I had always been, I was free to prepare without interference. My manager continued to speak about long-term plans as if I were a fixture. He referenced future quarters, upcoming initiatives. When we get through the next phase, he'd say, you'll help us stabilize things. I listened, I nodded, I took notes. And internally, I marked each assumption. What they never noticed was that my loyalty had shifted from the organization to my own integrity. I wasn't planning an escape, I was building alignment with my values, my capabilities, and my future. Preparation, I learned, isn't about control. It's about reducing fear, about knowing that when the moment comes to choose, you won't be choosing from desperation. By the time the final piece fell into place, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. The reveal didn't happen in a meeting. No email flagged it. No one else witnessed it. That was the point. It happened late one evening, after most of the office had emptied out. I was reviewing a routine report, something I'd looked at dozens of times before, when a pattern finally aligned in my mind. Not new information, just information seen clearly, all at once. I realized how much of the company's operational continuity relied on undocumented judgment calls. Not policies, not SOPs, judgment. Decisions that live in experience rather than paper. And most of those decisions flowed through me. The leverage wasn't a secret exploit or a hidden weakness. It was structural dependence. For years, I had been translating between departments, anticipating issues before they surfaced, adjusting timelines quietly, absorbing friction so leadership could believe things were running smoothly. None of that was written down in a way that captured its complexity. And that was the reveal. If I stepped away cleanly, without drama, without sabotage, the system wouldn't collapse. It would drift, slowly, inefficiently, expensively. That kind of impact doesn't trigger alarms right away. It triggers meetings, confusion, delays that no one can quite explain. I didn't feel triumphant when I saw it. I felt calm. Because the reveal wasn't about power over others. It was about power over my own choices. For the first time, I understood that leaving wouldn't make me reckless or irresponsible. It would simply expose assumptions that had been left unexamined for too long. I also realized something more personal. I no longer needed validation from people who had grown comfortable not offering it. My sense of worth had quietly detached from their recognition. That was the most important leverage of all. I reviewed my notes, my documentation, my growing skill set. Everything aligned, not into a plan of action, but into a state of readiness. I didn't rush. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even decide to leave yet. I just sat with clarity. Knowing you can leave changes how you breathe, how you speak, how you listen. The anxiety drains away, replaced by something steadier. Choice. From that moment on, I was no longer staying by default. I was staying conscious. And conscious staying is temporary by nature. The reveal closed a chapter internally, even though nothing had changed externally. The office lights turned off automatically. The building emptied. I packed my bag and left as I always did. The next morning, I showed up on time. Did my work, smiled when appropriate. No one suspected that the balance had already shifted, because the most decisive changes rarely announce themselves. They happen quietly, in private, when someone finally understands their own position clearly and chooses not to explain it to anyone else. Clarity doesn't demand immediate action. That's one of its most misunderstood qualities. After the reveal, I didn't feel rushed. I felt patient in a way that was new to me, grounded, not hesitant. The decision point arrived slowly, disguised as normal days. I began to notice how differently I responded to stress once leaving was a real option. Deadlines didn't tighten my chest anymore. Urgent requests didn't spike my pulse. When something went wrong, I handled it professionally, but without internalizing it as my responsibility to save everyone else. That emotional distance was informative. I realized that what had once felt like commitment had gradually turned into obligation. And obligation, when it outlives purpose, becomes erosion. I listed my options honestly. I could stay and ask for more visibility, more authority, more recognition. But that path required others to reimagine me, and I had learned how unlikely that was without disruption. I could stay and continue as I was, leveraging my security and familiarity, but that meant accepting the role permanently, accepting that I would always be the quiet constant. Or I could leave, cleanly, without accusation, without spectacle. The third option felt irreversible, and that's why it carried weight. Leaving would force change, not through confrontation, but through absence. It would close the loop I had been living inside for years. I didn't frame it as quitting, I framed it as alignment. With myself, with my values, with the version of my life that didn't require me to shrink to be useful. The decision crystallized one morning during a routine conversation with my manager. He was outlining plans for the next year, speaking in confident generalities. "When things settle down," he said, "this will be a great place to grow long term." He said it with certainty, with comfort. And I realized, calmly and without bitterness, that his version of long term didn't include growth for me. It included continuity. In that moment, the decision settled, not emotionally, but structurally. I saw the path forward clearly. I would leave. Not immediately, not impulsively, but intentionally. I decided to move in silence, to prepare my exit with the same care I had given everything else, to protect my integrity, my reputation, and my future. I didn't owe anyone an explanation before I was ready, and I didn't need permission to choose myself. That afternoon, I wrote a short list in my notebook. Not reasons, not grievances, just non-negotiables. Dignity, clean transition, no burned bridges. Once the decision was made, everything else became logistics. I wasn't afraid anymore, and I wasn't angry. I was done. Once the decision was made, my world narrowed in a precise way. Not emotionally, logistically. I shifted from reflection to execution, and I did it quietly, the way I did everything else. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't withdraw effort. From the outside, nothing changed. Inside, everything was aligned. I reviewed my finances carefully, calculated runway, reduced unnecessary expenses. I wasn't leaving to chase uncertainty. I was leaving from a position of stability. That mattered to me. I wanted choice, not pressure. I updated my resume in private late at night. I was honest on it in a way I had never been before. Not inflated, not modest. Accurate. I described my work the way it actually functioned, not the way it had been framed for convenience. Seeing it written that way was clarifying. It reminded me that my contributions had always been real, even when they weren't publicly acknowledged. I reached out to a small number of people I trusted, quiet conversations framed as curiosity. I didn't speak badly about my current role. I didn't frame myself as stuck. I asked about fit, about growth, about environments that valued clarity over comfort. Those conversations were calm, grounded, free of urgency. At work, I continued documenting. I cleaned up my systems, not to hand them over perfectly, but to ensure that when I left, I could do so responsibly. I refused to sabotage, even unintentionally. That wasn't who I was. My manager remained relaxed around me. He delegated freely, trusted deeply. He spoke about future initiatives as if my presence in them was guaranteed. Each assumption made the contrast sharper. There's a particular discipline required to move in silence. It means resisting the urge to be seen, to seek reassurance, to test reactions. Silence preserves optionality. I declined to overshare when asked about my long-term plans. I used neutral language. I'm focused on the current quarter. I'm evaluating what makes sense next. All true, all incomplete. I also prepared emotionally. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, not to defend myself, but to remain calm, to speak clearly without over-explaining, to avoid the trap of justifying a decision that didn't require consensus. What surprised me was how peaceful this phase felt. There was no rush, no fear of being found out. I wasn't hiding something wrong. I was protecting something right. Comfort had made them careless. Silence gave me freedom. By the time I finalized my next step, I wasn't anxious. I was steady, ready to close one chapter cleanly and open another without spectacle. They still believed I'd never quit, and that belief was about to meet reality. The consequences didn't arrive with my resignation. They began before that, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way structural shifts usually do. It started with small delays, a report that took longer than expected to finalize. A question was routed to the wrong person. A decision was paused because someone wasn't sure who had final say. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. From the outside, it looked like a normal fluctuation in workflow. From the inside, I recognized it immediately. I had already begun pulling back in subtle, ethical ways, not withholding information, but no longer anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated, no longer correcting mistakes before they surfaced. I responded to what was asked, not what I knew would eventually be needed. This wasn't punishment, it was accurate. The system was experiencing itself without my silent interventions. My manager noticed the friction first, though he didn't name it. He asked more questions, checked timelines more often. His tone shifted slightly, from relaxed to mildly alert. "Things feel a bit slower lately," he said once, almost to himself. I nodded. "There are a few dependencies that haven't been clarified yet. True, neutral, non-accusatory." Others began to feel it too. Meetings ran longer. Emails multiplied. People circled the same issues without resolution. The absence of a clear through line created uncertainty, not panic, just inefficiency. No one traced it back to me because from their perspective, I was still there. Still calm, still doing my job. That's the thing about invisible work. You don't notice it until it stops cushioning the fall. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. The reveal had been accurate. The dependence was real. Still, I haven't acted yet. The consequences needed to unfold naturally, without my interference. I didn't want my departure to feel like a shockwave. I wanted it to feel like a realization. Eventually, my manager scheduled a check-in. He asked if I was feeling overwhelmed, if there was anything he could take off my plate. The irony wasn't lost on me. I answered honestly but selectively. "I'm managing what's in scope. There's been some complexity lately." He nodded, thoughtful, already trying to solve the problem without naming its source. At that moment, I understood something important. By the time people feel the loss, it's already too late to prevent it. Because what they're responding to isn't the person, it's the gap. And gaps don't negotiate. By the time concern turned into urgency, the foundation had already shifted. It showed up first in the language people used. Conversations became reactive instead of strategic. Meetings that once ended with clarity now ended with action items. More of them, less precise. The same questions surfaced repeatedly, each time framed as if they were new. "Didn't we already decide this?" someone asked in one meeting. Silence followed, then guesses. I watched it happen without inserting myself, not out of detachment, but out of respect for reality. The system was revealing its true dependencies, and naming them prematurely would have softened the lesson without changing the structure. My manager grew visibly unsettled. He began looping me into conversations again, asking for input that used to be assumed. There was a subtle shift in his tone, more careful, more attentive, not apologetic, curious. "Walk me through how you'd approach this," he said more than once. I did, calmly, professionally, without reasserting ownership. That distinction mattered. The attempts to fix it came next. Leadership discussed process improvements. New tools were mentioned. Temporary task forces formed. Consultants were briefly floated as an option. All of it treated the symptoms. No one addressed the underlying issue. The system had been built on the assumption that one person would always absorb complexity without recognition or backup. That assumption was no longer safe. What struck me most was the absence of blame. No one accused me of anything. No one suggested I had failed. Instead, there was confusion. How could things feel so unstable when nothing obvious had changed? Because the change wasn't new. It had just stopped being hidden. My manager scheduled another one-on-one, longer this time. He asked about my workload again, about sustainability, about whether I felt supported. These were good questions. They were also late. I answered honestly, but without opening doors I had already closed. I think the structure could benefit from clearer ownership, I said, less reliance on informal knowledge. He nodded slowly. We should have addressed that sooner. He didn't stay with you. He didn't say for you, just sooner. That was when I knew there was no version of staying that would resolve this cleanly. Any attempt to recalibrate now would be driven by fear of loss, not genuine recognition. And I wasn't interested in being valued only at the moment of absence. The window for correction had passed, not because they were incapable, but because the system had learned the wrong lesson for too long. Comfort had bred mistakes, and now, even with good intentions, there wasn't enough time to undo them. The conversation happened on a Tuesday morning. No build-up, no tension in the calendar invite, just a standard one-on-one scheduled for 30 minutes. I came prepared, not with arguments, but with clarity. My manager started the meeting the way he always did, asking about current priorities. I answered. Then I paused, just long enough to shift the tone without dramatizing it. I wanted to talk about my next steps, I said. He looked up, attentive now. I told him I had made the decision to leave, that I would be submitting my notice that day, that I wanted to ensure a clean, responsible transition. I didn't explain why in detail. I didn't recount history. I didn't list grievances. Silence filled the space for a moment, not shock, but recalibration. I didn't expect that, he said finally. I nodded. I know. He asked if something specific had happened, if there was anything the company could do to change my mind. Those questions were sincere, and they came too late to carry weight. I answered calmly. This isn't about a single issue. It's about alignment. I've thought carefully about it. He leaned back, processing. I could see the realization forming, not fully articulated, but present. The connection between the recent instability and my decision. I wish you'd said something sooner, he said. I met his gaze. I don't think it would have changed the structure. That was the only direct truth I offered, not as an accusation, as a fact. There was no argument after that, just practical questions, timelines, handover plans, who should be informed, and when. The conversation stayed professional, respectful, quiet. At one point, he said something that confirmed everything without intending to. We've relied on you more than we realized. I thanked him, not sarcastically, genuinely. Recognition that arrives at the end still counts as recognition, but it doesn't obligate you to stay. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my desk and wrote the resignation email. Clear, gracious, final. No one else knew yet. The office hummed as usual. Phones rang. People typed. There was no release of tension, no emotional fallout, just a steady sense of closure. Confrontation doesn't require heat to be effective. Sometimes calm is what makes the truth unavoidable. After I gave notice, people began to see me differently, not because I had changed, but because the role they had assigned me was dissolving. Suddenly, my time mattered. My insights were sought more deliberately. Questions came with context. Meetings were scheduled with intention. It was subtle but unmistakable. I noticed it without resentment. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was recalibration. People often don't understand the value of something until it has an end date. What mattered more to me was how I saw myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran around me. I wasn't absorbing tension to keep others comfortable. I wasn't translating silence into service. I was simply present. The weeks that followed were clean. I documented what needed to be documented. I answered questions honestly. I didn't overextend myself to compensate for the transition. I respected the boundaries I had set, and no one pushed against them. My manager thanked me more than once for my work, for my professionalism, for the way I handled my departure. His gratitude was real. It just came from a different place than it would have years earlier. I didn't regret staying as long as I had. I learned things there about systems, about people, about myself that I couldn't have learned anywhere else. But I also didn't regret leaving. The version of me who stayed quiet out of habit no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood the difference between humility and invisibility. Who I am now is not louder, not sharper, not hardened. I'm more deliberate. I choose environments that don't require me to disappear in order to belong. I speak early when it matters. I don't wait to be noticed before I contribute. And when I'm quiet now, it's because I'm listening, not because I'm shrinking. That distinction changed everything. There's a quiet lesson in all of this, and it has nothing to do with winning or proving a point. It's about attention. Not the kind you demand, and not the kind you perform for, but the kind you give to your own inner signals. The small moments of discomfort, the patterns that repeat just often enough to be ignored, the roles you slip into because they feel familiar, even when they no longer fit. For a long time, I believed that being indispensable was a form of security, that if I made myself useful enough, steady enough, low maintenance enough, I would be protected. What I learned instead is that indispensability, when paired with silence, can turn into invisibility. And invisibility isn't safety, it's stasis. The people around me weren't cruel. They weren't malicious. They were comfortable. And comfort breeds mistakes, especially the mistake of assuming that someone who has always stayed will always stay. My manager didn't think I'd ever quit because he underestimated me as a person. He thought that because I had never shown him a reason to imagine otherwise, I had taught him what to expect by never changing the pattern. That doesn't make him a villain. It makes the system human. The responsibility in the end was shared, but the decision to remain or to leave was mine alone. I didn't leave with anger. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I left because I no longer wanted my silence to be mistaken for consent. There's power in walking away without burning anything down, in choosing alignment over argument, in letting your absence say what your presence never could. If this story resonates, it may be because you recognize a version of yourself in it. The reliable one, the quiet one, the person others lean on without fully seeing. If that's you, I hope you take this not as a call to action, but as an invitation to awareness. You don't need to explode to be heard. You don't need to stay to be loyal. And you don't need permission to choose differently. So I'll leave you with one open question. No right answer, no pressure to respond unless you want to. At what point does being dependable start costing you the version of yourself you're becoming?